Is this video as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All
All
right, go
right.
ahead.
Welcome
Sure.
to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. All of us are susceptible to hearing narratives, public narratives about a candidate, about a television show, about culture, whatever. It's a subject that really intrigues me, so we're going to talk about it today with an assistant professor of instruction at the University of Texas at Austin, Communication Studies, Moody College of Communication. Now, I hope I get your name right, Professor Joe Cuthbert.
That's
Did,
correct.
did
Cut
I
your
get it
finger,
right?
birth a baby. Yeah,
All
Cutbirth.
right. Cuthbert, Joe Cuthbert is here to talk to us today. Welcome to the show, Professor.
Glad to be here, Michael.
What is a public narrative? What does the term mean?
Sure. Well, if to get down to really kind of just to parse all down to the core, a narrative is really a story. It's a character over time with purpose. So when I've taught narrative writing in school, and we really think about a narrative, what makes a narrative different than like an advertisement or whatever is it's a story. It's Captain Ahab going after Moby Dick, right? It's Huck Finn on the Mississippi with Jim. It's all kinds of things. It's also, for example, unfortunately, the example I use a lot of times in public narratives, I use a woman, Candy Lightner. Candy Lightner may be a name that's kind of sort of familiar. Do you know what she did and who she was? Is that name for you?
No.
Have you heard about? Well, Candy Lightner was a woman who had a daughter, a teenage daughter, walking home from school, hit and killed by a drunk driver. Candy Lightner had a story to tell. And she told the story over and over and over until she started a group called, I know you've heard of it, Mothers
Mothers
Against Drunk,
Against Drunk Driving. Yeah, now I know.
has saved that story that Candy Lightner, a person who never set out to change the world until something horrible happened to her, she had a story to tell. And she told it. And she got doors slammed in her face, and she went to city councils and legislatures and stood up against the alcohol and entertainment lobbies. Who is this woman trying to do this? Eventually, people recognized what was happening, and she changed the world. And there's an untold number of lives that were saved because Candy Lightner had a narrative. She had a story to tell. And so when I teach this, I teach it that way. Of Adam Walsh, the man who, unfortunately,
Yes.
his boy was taken, right? And so he had a story to tell. And he ended up starting the Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And so these narratives are very powerful. Our brains, cognitively, the science behind it is our brains are hardwired. Our operating systems put together stories. We want to collect data and then connect the data, and we do it through stories in your head. So it's very natural for us to say, what have you heard about Joe Cutbirth? What have you heard about Michael Liebowitz? What have you heard about Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton or whoever? We tell stories. We're storytellers, and it's a way we process our environment. And so these public narratives have a really, really powerful way to shape how we see the world and maybe how we react to it. Go ahead.
How are narratives like this formed, and how do they come together? Like, I'm trying to think of one now. Like, there was a narrative when I was a kid about Dan Quayle. He was the vice president, and and to this day, people think of Dan Quayle. He was the dumb guy that was the vice president, and that was all. It seems started over this misspelling of the word potato.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
is that how they're formed usually?
Well, yeah, I mean, what I would offer is potato. That is what I would think of more as an anecdote or a vignette, like a small slice, right? Something that happened. It happened very fast. It was something that you can tell. Maybe there's humor to it. Maybe there's sarcasm to it. Maybe there's a point to it. But the difference maybe between an anecdote and a narrative, like I said, is that a narrative is time bound. It's a character doing something over time with a purpose. And so with Quayle, Gerald back earlier, maybe closer to a little bit before him, Gerald Ford, right? Clumsy guy, right? Gerald Ford was an All-American football player for Michigan, but somehow everybody decided he was completely physically incapable of doing anything. He fell down and one time ate a tamale with the corn husk on or something. And this story began to take on a life of its own. But you have anecdotes or vignettes, right? The story, and they come in every political campaign. But I think the notion of what makes a narrative is that it's big. And a narrative, oftentimes there's causation. Oftentimes there's what we say is the plot begins when the unexpected happens. So people think about plot, right? When you think about plot, it's my dog. It's my dog. It's my buddy Mac. So when he hears me in here talking on the computer, he wants to let the dog in there barking about. Um, um, a narrative would be more like, I would use this for an example. Jackie Kennedy. The story around the Kennedy presidency is called Camelot.
Yeah.
Right. We talk about Camelot, but they talk about Jackie Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy, there's a whole romance story between Jackie and John Kennedy. But when Camelot began, was Jackie Kennedy is riding in a parade in Dallas, Texas. She hears a pop, and her husband's brains are in her lap. Talk about the unexpected happening and something that changed her life, and it changed the life of the country. So at that moment, Jackie Kennedy becomes the keeper of the flame. And she starts creating this narrative around the Kennedy presidency that famously involved the Broadway play that was the hit of the era, Camelot. And so she appropriated this narrative in that way. And so I would think of a narrative as an overlay, as the big picture, as something that happened, a journey of sorts. And so that would make it different than like an anecdote or a vignette about something. That makes sense?
Yeah. Are narratives generally accurate? Like you mentioned the one about Gerald Ford. I remember always hearing about George Bush, the first one, about what a wimp he was. I believe he was a college athlete as well, and he was also a World War II hero and whatnot, but he's thought of as a wimp. And so are these, once they think, they usually accurate, or should they just be ignored?
So I think some of that, what we know is there's spin, there's contextualizing something. People wanted to portray Bush, the wimp factor, very unfair, very, very unfair storyline about President Bush. Like you said, he was shot down as a fighter pilot, a World War II hero. That happened earlier. George McGovern, who was painted as this almost communist guy in 1972. He actually also was a very Medal of Honor World War II hero guy. So, very brave pilot. So oftentimes stories about people are contextualized in a certain way, and they're done oftentimes in political campaigns and with advertising to maybe shift the focus or the context around someone. But when I think of a narrative, I think of a very specific story. Right, like someone, like I said, like Candy Lightner or Adam Walsh, someone oftentimes who was a common person. The unexpected happens. They begin telling a story, and they tell that story over and over, and they enforce social change. And when I talk about public narratives, that's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm teaching about. Right? Yeah.
So, why do some narratives not make it? Like what leads one to be accepted and another not to be?
Let's see. First off, people like to be comfortable. People like to feel good, right? People like to feel good. And so what people are more likely to do is accept facts, stories, views of the world that match their own. So if a narrative around a certain person reinforces what people are predisposed to think of that person, then oftentimes people can pick it up and say, oh yeah, a narrative or what you were talking about maybe earlier was Obama's a Muslim. Barack Obama was not a Muslim, right? But there were people who wanted to believe he was for different reasons. And so they were very fast. And there's a very famous great moment where John McCain steps up, and it's a video, YouTube video, where a woman at a John McCain rally says Obama's a Muslim and I can't go for that. And McCain stops the rally and says, no, ma'am, he's not a Muslim. He's actually a Christian man. We just have very different views of the best direction for this country, but he's not a Muslim. And he corrects that. And that was a very brave and noble thing for John McCain to do at a rally, right? Because at a rally, you're supposed to be ginning up everybody to be supporting you and whatever. And John McCain showed a lot of incredible character there at that moment to say, my campaign is going to have some dignity, and I'm not going to go down that road and just let anything be out there. So sometimes some take off, sometimes some don't. I think it depends on people are predisposed to believe things. When they don't, when the world conflicts with what you're predisposed to believe, you have what's called cognitive dissonance. You know, I gave students in a class one time when we were studying this, a multiple choice test that we did in real time in the class. And the answer to 10 questions in a row was B. And I let them circle B 10 times in a row on a test. And then at the end, I said, is there anything that you felt want to talk about or whatever? And they were all the answers B? And I was like, yeah. And they're like, wow. And I was like, what's wrong with that? Why can't they all be B? But they had never had a test like that, right? So they thought I was being tricky. I'm like, and I said, I want you to think about this. You left thinking about the material for what you thought the test should look like. That's the same logic that says, I know what a terrorist looks like. She wore a scarf, so I shot her. Right? I know what something looks like before I examine it, so I'm going to react to the picture in my head. So if we have those actual feelings about things that don't mesh with us, and when we're confronted with it, we can do two things. We can take back, take a deep breath, reevaluate, or we can go la 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 la, not happening. I don't want to feel uncomfortable. And that's different people do it different ways.
What role do emotions play in this? Like, it seems to me what you're talking about, that emotion plays a very big part in accepting a narrative. I think you mentioned that you said how it makes people feel, but it seems like the emotional connection to a narrative is a very strong dynamic.
Ah, a public intellectual back in the 1920s, Walter Lippmann, wrote a book called Public Opinion about this, right? And he uses that cave allegory that Plato had, where it's like prisoners and they're looking at shadows on the wall. These prisoners are in a cave and they're chained down and they're looking at a wall, and there's stuff happening out on a road and their shadows are happening. And the prisoners actually start believing that the shadows on the wall are reality, right? So I ask students sometimes, and I say, I don't want anybody to embarrass themselves or be uncomfortable. I'll say, how many of you really like Hillary Clinton? And some will raise their hand and some will scowl. And I'll say, how many of you really don't like Hillary Clinton? Same thing, we'll flip. How many of you like Donald Trump? Same thing. How many of you don't like Donald Trump? Then I say, how many of you have hung out with Hillary Clinton? Goose egg, right? How many of you have hung out with Donald Trump? Goose egg. And I'm like, how can you have strong feelings about these people that you've never actually encountered? How can you really get, you've never even encountered these people? And the answer is, we have pseudo realities. We have pseudo images, pictures in our head that come through mass media. And so you're not born liking Hillary Clinton or liking Donald Trump or not, but somehow you get these stories and you start putting something together and figuring out if it meshes with your values. But you're actually relying on mediated discourse. You're relying on mass media. And Plato, this is why we think Plato was so brilliant. He wrote that 300 BC. There weren't television or films or photographs of anyone, but there were these pseudo realities that we all engage in. And it comes to us from orality. Rhetoric is a form of medium. So it came to rhetoric mostly in those days. So we get ideas passed to us from media and our social connections. And then these stories either jibe with them or they don't.
It's interesting to me that you mentioned that, because I've been a regular guest on a local talk show here in Connecticut. I don't know, going back a little bit more than 5 years now. And what's the word I'm looking for here? The perception that some of the callers into the show have of me bears very little relation to how I am. And it goes to interpreting things that I say in ways that have nothing to do with what I've actually said. And that I've seen that happen to myself, to many, many people online, where someone will say something like, if a guy, for instance, I've been accused online of being both a shill for Trump and a shill for Biden, of being a Zionist and a defender of Hamas. And it's just because the people have almost a narrative in their minds that if you're not where they are, then you must be on the other camp. But it's not reality. That's not really what's going on. And I think that that's kind of the type of dynamic that led me to ask you the question about what role emotion plays, because those are emotional reactions. They're not intellectual reactions.
Comfort and security. We like feeling, and there's nothing wrong with that, really. I mean, we like to feel good, and we like to feel secure, and we like to feel comforted or wherever we are. But when something may be a perceived challenge to that, then what they have that thing called fight or flight syndrome, right? Pick a fight or run away. And when people feel threatened, you know, one of the things that the psychologists and the biologists will tell you is we have certain centers of our brain, and when you perceive danger, when your emotion is danger, and danger can be a bear coming at you, or it can be finding out you're the only one in the room who sees things a certain way and you think everybody's going to yell at you or whatever it is. When you feel danger or scared, your brain literally shuts down the flow of blood to the part of your brain where rational discourse is formulated, and starts sending blood to your thighs, to your actual, so you can run. That's an evolutionary survival thing. So your brain will redo your body. So have you ever been in an argument and it got really heated, and then 2 hours later you're like, oh, why didn't I just say boom? It's because your body literally shut down so that you weren't thinking, right? When you feel that way. And so some of this is physiology, and it's fascinating. It's fascinating. You could, in that moment, outrun the leopard or the bear, but you can't discuss with your wife why, you didn't pick up this whatever at the Home Depot today and you left the kid at the baseball game, right? You get scared, or you get, threatened, and your brain changes literally physically how you respond to the situation.
Given the strong emotional connection that people have to the narratives that they accept, how do public narratives get broken, or do they get broken? Off the top of my head, I can't think of any that have been broken, but there must be.
There were some really, really, really horrible, I think more than narratives, just value systems. What happened with the civil rights movement is the most profound change in the country. We've had some movements. I mean, or I'll tell you, I've never seen anything in this country go as fast as what happened with the LGBT community from the early 90s to gay marriage, right? That's something
true, yeah.
That just went wham. That was a profound social change that really nobody saw coming until just all of a sudden it was there, and then now we have it, right? But if you look at like the trajectory of what it took for Black Americans to and move into mainstream, or to be accepted, or at least be treated with the dignity that they deserve as human beings and citizens of this country, that took decades and decades and decades and decades. And I think the most important thing that you'll see is when people actually encounter people that perhaps they might not have encountered before. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about some of the unrest on the college campuses. And I asked him, I said, and we're talking about, we're in Texas. And I asked my friend, he was asking about it at UT. And I said, let me ask you this. How many Jewish friends did you have growing up? And most of us had some Jewish friends growing up and I'm not Jewish, but most of us did. Going to school with, new in college. I said, how many Palestinian friends did you have growing up? And almost everyone I know is like, I didn't have any Palestinian friends growing up. So I think that's a start in who are you more comfortable with listening to, and where do these narratives come in? And the way that sometimes some of these unfortunate narratives get broken is you actually physically encounter people that you've only heard about, that you've only had that picture on the wall that Plato and Lippmann were talking about, right? All of a sudden, whether it's Romeo and Juliet or West Side Story, that's as old as I tell my students that's called master plot, just a generic phrase. two kids whose families didn't grow up and thought the other family was like bad news. Guess what? They get to be teenagers and they think each other's interesting, and then all of a sudden they're dating secretly, and all hell breaks loose. Right? That's a story. That story's been old as, like I said, Romeo and Juliet, West Side Story. So personally encountering people, keeping an open mind, listening. I like to talk about the notion of maybe we can take agreement off the table and just talk about understanding. What if when we got together and started talking about things like the things that were happening on the college campuses, like other things in this country, what if we took agreement off the table? Because agreement, I think some people think if I agree, I lose something. It's an innate loss for me if I agree. But if we could just talk about understanding, I think that's a really interesting approach to maybe challenging some of these narratives.
I noticed in doing a little bit of research preparing for this interview that there are a lot of organizations that teach how to shape a narrative.
Oh yeah.
And I get it. Like I would want to take a communication class. I like to be an effective communicator, but at the same time, the idea of shaping narratives, it seems to me it can be dangerous as well, because there's literally organizations that have studied human psychology and are teaching how to manipulate the thinking of other people, how to get them to accept a given narrative. Am I right? I mean, I know it can be used for good, but isn't there a downside to this? And what are some of the downsides, I guess, is another question.
Well, most psychologists will tell you that people, by the time they're in their 20s, by the time they're adults, people rarely change their fundamental values. So it's very, very unlikely that if you support a woman's right to reproductive freedom, that someone is going to talk at you long enough to turn you anti-abortion, right? Or capital punishment. If you believe that capital punishment is wrong, it's very unlikely that
I got a question for you.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I have a question, because this is kind of goes to what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It's language, and it's how language is used. Now, if I had a right-wing conservative on the show, he would say pro-life. For somebody that is anti-abortion, he would use the term pro-life, and somebody that's pro-choice, he would refer to them as pro-abortion. I noticed that you said somebody that is pro-reproductive freedom, and then you said, I believe you
I
said,
was trying to stay as neutral as I could, and
but what role does language play, I guess, is really what I'm getting at, because when you communicate, it's like as old one of the first examples I can remember is in the founding of the country, where there were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and the Federalists adopted the term that actually applied to the Anti-Federalist position. But what it did was put the Anti-Federalists in the position of taking that clunky name, and it plays a role. I don't know how big of a role it played, but it does play a role.
Language is incredibly powerful. In fact, rhetoric is the fundamental communicative act. I mean, rhetoric, talking, and the point of rhetoric is always to persuade. And again, I go back to the classics and go back to Aristotle. Writes a lot about this, and he has a book called Rhetoric. But what I think I would offer with language is language is contextual, and language always changes. And so you've got to, it's parsing that. It has to come down to what value are you actually touching in here? I think at the root of all of this, people have a fundamental value on most of these issues. Rarely on things, like I said, like capital punishment, abortion rights, whatever those things are. People just tend to have a gut sense. I'm for this, and they're rarely going to change. Sometimes, I know I had a friend who used to say, someone I really respected, he would, and looked up to a mentor of mine, who would always say, is that a conversation starter or a conversation stopper? Right? And so, and I listened to him a lot, and he wrote a lot about this. He wrote a lot about coming into the notion of a public sphere, a place where we can talk about these things, what the First Amendment really is for. Do you come into the public sphere ready to, in what he would say, good faith, or do you come into the public sphere to manipulate or vanquish the enemy? And one is a discussion, and one is is an active battle. And how you use rhetoric in those, depending on what are your goals, who are you really in this process, I think is fascinating and poignant. It's really important. I'll tell you a conversation stopper, I think.
Okay.
And I'll probably get jumped on for this. Check your privilege. Oh boy, my friends on the left say that all the time. Check your privilege. Check your privilege. Right? Do you think that invites someone into a conversation, or do you think that makes someone look this? Right? Right?
Right.
You know, and there's other examples. There's tons of other examples. But I want to ask. I'm like, is there a way to? I understand that there is privilege in this society. I absolutely get that. And if you can't see that, maybe a different way is let's talk about privilege. Let's talk about what it means to start a little ahead of other people by things that really weren't nothing you could help, or start a little behind it. I can walk into a classroom of mine, I guarantee you, with about 90% accuracy, after about 2 weeks, I can tell which students in my college classes, I can tell you who had parents who knew their grade school teachers' names. And I can tell you,
Wow.
and I can tell you who's comfortable in that room, who knows how to take notes, who knows where they're going, and I can tell you who's uncomfortable in that room, who doesn't really know what to do. And they may be their parents may not have known their grade school teachers' names because they may have had a single mother who's having to work 3 jobs and couldn't, bake a cake for the PTA meeting, right? Those kids have nothing to do with that. But I know that some come into my room more prepared to do the work we're going to do, and I have to kind of look at that. So there's all kinds of privilege around. But how you talk about it, I think, if you talk about it in a way that is maybe, like I said, is a conversation stopper.
Well, yeah, if someone tells me I have privilege, I grew up in a housing project on welfare and had 2 heroin addicts for parents, both in and out of jail. So somebody says to me, you have privilege. And I think that as humans, we look at ourselves as individuals. When I talk to you, I don't know your context. I don't know what you're bringing here, other than, what I've read in preparation. But even that, like you said earlier, about people that hate public figures, they don't even know. And from my perspective, the idea that I'm privileged is absolutely ridiculous. So when someone says that, you're right. It immediately, it's like, well, hold on a second. You know what I mean?
And so rather than agree, so here's what I'll tell you. The first time I became aware of that in certain ways, I was in a workshop, and the guy that was leading the workshop had everyone in the room stand up, and he said, if you have rethought the way you were walking home from a building late at night in the last 6 months, go ahead and sit down. If you have parked your car higher in a garage so that you were closer to the elevator, go ahead and sit down. If you've walked to your car with your keys in your hand or have a whistle on your keychain, go ahead and sit down. And then he said, look around. Every female in the room was sitting down, and every male in the room was standing up. I'm not a big tough guy, but I don't, on a general daily basis, think of being assaulted. I don't live with that. I don't carry that around with me. But when I saw every female friend of mine in that room sitting down, that's what some people might talk about as privilege. That I don't have to worry about that. It doesn't drain me a little bit. So that doesn't mean I certainly am not the richest guy in the room. I'm not the best looking guy in the room, or you're the smartest guy in the room, but different ways that happens. And so I think if we can just understand a little bit more how some of us may have experienced our life, I think it takes away that binary thing of your privilege, you're not, your privilege, you're not, your privilege, you're. I mean, how do you tell a coal miner in West Virginia with an 8th grade education that they're privileged over Will and Jada Pinkett Smith?
Yeah, good luck.
Right. Right. So it's just so in that side, right? You can make that, you can enter that conversation in good faith, in a way to say, let's have a conversation, or you can enter that conversation in a way that just blows it up and lets everybody sit here like this. And I think language is really, really key to that, and an open heart.
Well, see that scenario that you gave, or the experience where you kept telling people to sit down, that's a perspective or a perception
Yeah.
breaker, right? Or shifter. It causes a person's perception to shift because of what they're actually seeing. Whereas when you use language and put somebody on the defensive, that that doesn't happen. You're not allowing for the perception to shift. And in relation to public narratives, especially the ones that are being thrusted upon us or are being manipulated by organizations like the ones I talked about, it seems like that would be a way to break that narrative, is to shift our perspective, to look at things differently. It reminds me of in my introduction to psychology classes, or class where we took they talk about first order primary processing and secondary processing, where primary processing is just where you emotionally react to something. It's
Mhm.
your immediate response, whereas secondary processing is where you take the time to think, to reflect, to examine it. And I want you to tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems like that would be a good way to not just accept somebody's manipulations or attempts to get me to accept the narrative, because I'm actually thinking about it. Whereas if I'm just basically taking it in by osmosis and just accepting the first emotional reaction I have as truth, I'll be more susceptible to whatever narrative happens to come along.
Well, what psychologists will tell you is we have a truth bias. Our cognitive, the hardware, the or the software, what's running up here says you are going to believe, unless something is very fast and very hard, causing you to say what, you're going to believe what people tell you. So, like, if you were, if I tell a student, if you were walking across campus and someone said, can you tell me which way to the library? And you went down there, take a left, go 2 blocks, and it's on the right side of the street. Someone would walk down there 2 blocks, take a left, go to the right side. That we don't, as human beings, say, I'm not sure they gave me the right directions. Maybe I need to ask 3 more people. You would never get through life if every single piece of data that came
Right.
to you, you had to say, wait a minute, I can't believe you tend to believe what people tell you, right? Unless it really, really goes against something fundamental here, or it somehow triggers a fear mechanism, right? So, that, and I think we have to learn as we get to be adults to, that's the challenge sometimes with the internet, right? You find things on the internet that you want to believe. Have you ever forwarded something in social media without checking it out, and then later found out that wasn't
Well,
true, whatever,
this happened to me actually because
many of us have done that.
I
Yeah.
spent a lot of years in prison. So when I got out of
Oh,
prison, social media was new to me. And I didn't know that there's quotes on there that aren't real. I see a quote, I thought, I like that quote, let me share it. And then someone jumps all over me.
mhm.
That's not an actual quote. That person didn't say that. And then I go, oh, so now I know. Don't If I see somebody's quoted, check and source it, see if it's accurate, because I didn't know. But people do that frequently.
Absolutely. I saw one actually this morning. It was that I got a chuckle out of. It was like, um, not everything you read on the internet is real. Abraham Lincoln.
I've seen that one. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
right. Yeah. So, people do learn there. Listen, there are people who come into our public debate and in the public sphere as bad actors. They come in wanting that, feeling like it's a chess game. How do I manipulate? How do I benefit? Who can I vanquish? How do I one up somebody? Then there are other people who come into these negotiations, or these discussions, saying, let's talk. I want to hear what you think about something. When I said that about taking agreement off the table and replacing it with understanding, tell me what it is you need from this situation, right? Instead of, let's find a place where you give up half of what you want and I have half of what I want, right? One is going to lead to this, and one of them might lead to, I don't know what, but let's go down that road. what is it, you guys who are protesting today, what is it you need? What is going on? Do you need health care for your children? Do you need a sense of security in your neighborhood? Do you need economic opportunity? What is it you need? Not what is it I have to give up and meet you halfway on? You know what I'm saying? And those are two very different ways. Or how can I beat you? Tell me what you want, and I'll figure out how to beat you and not give you any of that and take all your stuff. And different actors come in with different agendas and with different goals. And so I think the way we learn to talk to each other is valuable. I think going back to the public narrative notion, it comes in with, sometimes people have stories to tell. And some of these stories are fascinating and empowering and important. And like I said, I use Candy Lightner a lot. I've never met the woman, but she's, and she's a great example, because it's incountable how many lives were saved, how many fathers weren't killed by drunk drivers and got to be in their daughters' weddings, right? How many people went ahead and had lives and helped other people? We don't know, because she had a story to tell and she changed this country. And the notion of how powerful those narratives are when used for good. What's that thing? Use your Spider-Man powers for good.
See, that's a good narrative. What worries me are faulty narratives. And when you mentioned earlier about you'd go crazy, you'd never get through life if you tried to think through every single thing. It seems to me that somebody trying to establish a false narrative, they take advantage of that. The other day, I was having a conversation with an old friend of mine who is, well, he believes in a lot of conspiracies. So he asked me about the moon landing. Did I think that the moon landing was real? And I said, yes. And he said, well, what about, and he asked me, 3 or 4 things, and I was able to rebut the 3 or 4 things. And then finally I said to him, I said, here's the problem with this. If I were to chase down every single thing that you're claiming, I would get nothing else done. And I told him, I said, listen, I've got an interview on Tuesday where I'm going to be discussing public narratives. I have to do research for that. On Wednesday, I've got an interview about the theory of evolution. I've got to prepare for that. Friday, I've got a discussion about deductive and inductive reasoning. I've got to prepare for that. I simply cannot spend all of my time chasing down everybody that claims the moon landing was fake. I was able to, I can rebut the first couple of things you say, but if it's going to continue, and ultimately, what difference does it make to me? It's not really going to change my life. Even if I were to discover that the moon landing was fake, it's not like I'm going to say, oh my God, everything I've ever believed is faulty. I've got to completely change I wouldn't do that. But I think though that when a faulty narrative gets started, and I think politicians rely on that a lot, because who has time to investigate every claim that a politician makes about a given policy? So people just go with, what their emotions tell them, and politicians basically get away with murder because of that.
Well, one thing I would offer with your friend, perhaps, is when he says he doesn't believe the moon landing happened. It's not a hostile question. Just say, what is your evidence? Is I think, and when I've taught journalism before, I teach my students, oftentimes people will give you a quote that you think is the best quote that you needed to really make your story, and it'll be some inflammatory thing. It'll be something like, so-and-so has been a part of a secret cabal to bring down 7 countries with a secret family in Italy, or somebody will say something crazy like that, right? And you'll think, and the reporter will think, oh, I've got my great quote. And I always teach them, hang in there. When someone says something that really gets you like that, learn to hang in there, take a deep breath, and just politely say, what is your evidence of that? Where did you get that? And ask, and where did you get that? And who is your source for that? And who is that? And so when you start chipping away, that is the way you ask someone, what leads you to believe that? And if they're like, well, I just know those people are liars, that's not evidence, right?
No, it's not.
That's just conjecture. That's a value or whatever. But when you come back in a discussion in good faith, in a modest voice tone that creates a dialogue, and say, what is your evidence of that? What's the evidence that this group of people are lazy, or this group of people, abuse their children? or whatever those things are, right? What is your evidence? And sometimes it's anecdotal, and where's the data? And to come back into an empirical framework and say, where is the data that supports that hypothesis, or that led you to have that, and having those discussions in good faith and in a way that invite people, like I said, to start a conversation, not stop, I think is the goal. Now, let me say one thing. What I think you're talking about is a little different. I think you may be talking about what we're called propaganda. So the way I would parse the difference between a public narrative and propaganda is, I would say a public narrative is something that is true, that happened. It's a story that involves someone, a character over time with purpose, a plot that begins when the unexpected happens and has a moral to it. Propaganda is a different thing. That's intentionally designed to deceive, right? And so there's an ethical issue there. If someone comes in with an intent to gain by deception, that's not really what I think of as a public narrative.
Okay. Well,
yeah, and propaganda is a whole other thing. People have been studying propaganda propaganda has been going on since the Trojan horse, right? I mean, people have been lying to each other. Propaganda has been going on since the snake told Eve to eat the apple, whatever it is. It's been going on. People have been lying to each other from the start of humankind. So lying and deception is nothing new. Right?
I got to tell you, I've been blocked on numerous occasions on social media for asking that very question about evidence. Well, what's your evidence for that? And then they just block me.
Well, yes. I mean, that is the most fundamental, rational way to pursue a conversation. If someone says something that you find new or suspicious or whatever, just ask them. Well, I have a friend who says blah, blah, blah. That's not evidence. and hold down to that notion of something that can be seen, tested, that has been proved, whatever those things are. And when you can turn the conversation to that, I think that's really the mark of someone in good faith. There's nothing wrong with asking someone what their evidence is.
Not at all. Well, Professor, I think we've covered our topic. Where can people find you?
Oh, I'm highly Googleable, and I'm online. You go to University of Texas, College of Communication. Type my name in. Any University of Texas, it'll come up my profile. There's an email address there, a work email address. I'm glad to have another conversation with you anytime, Michael. It's really been nice to talk to you, and good luck with your show.
Oh, thank you so much, and thanks for joining us.
Okay, you take care. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Okay. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.